I'll Google how this pattern works and we'll be able to see it.
It should be, but I'll remind myself and send.
Welcome everybody to the second day. What I perhaps forgot to say yesterday is that it was indeed one of the aims of the conference to bring people from metaphysics and possible physics together. It was noted during dinner that the number of philosophers of physics is so much larger than the number of people from metaphysics. But that is because some of the metaphysicists in the end declined or had prior obligations. So I invited Ted Sider and Amy Thomason, and so the original program was an almost equal balance. But you can't always have what you want. Okay, our first speaker of today, David Schroeren. He's working at doing a PhD at Princeton University, and is originally from Germany, right? Yes. Okay. And he's going to explain to us why spin is discrete. Dave.
Thank you, Fred, and thanks very much for the invitation. I'm really glad to be here. Now, spin is a physical quantity that you can think of as, in a sense, paradigmatically quantum mechanical. It is a quantity that has no classical analog, no analog in the kind of physics that we were familiar with up to, say, the early 20th century. Now, to be sure, it is a kind of angular momentum, so we're familiar with the kind of property that is. Angular momentum is the quantity whose conservation through time, for example, is responsible for the fact that figure skaters spin more quickly when they draw their arms towards their body. So it's a kind of quantity that we know, and yet you can't really familiarize yourself completely with spin by just looking at classical physics. So it's a genuinely novel aspect of quantum mechanics. But there is another respect in which it is paradigmatically quantum mechanical, and that the respect is that spin is quantized. So here is an observation about mass, for example. It's the case for mass that for any two values of mass, there is a value of mass between them. So mass, you might say, is continuous. The values of mass are continuous. That is not the case for spin. It is the case for basically any physical quantity that we are familiar with from classical physics. Position, velocity, angular momentum, energy, and mass, as I've already mentioned. It's not the case for spin. It is not true in the case of spin that for any two values of spin, there is a value of spin between them. Let's say spin is discrete. Indeed, it's the case that values of spin differ by integer multiples of 1/2. And it's important to just appreciate for a moment that this aspect of spin plays an important role in showing that our world works the way it does, or at least it figures importantly in our best theories about how the world works. It's lies at the foundation of our distinction between fermions and bosons, two kinds of particles that obey different laws, different statistics. So it seems like a natural question to ask. Why is spin discrete? Why does spin have this property? What makes spin discrete? Now, as far as metaphysical questions go, it strikes me that this is a fairly deep and fundamental one. It's a bit like asking why is space and time continuous, or why is the space of our everyday experience three-dimensional. Just like space and time, spin is part of our, at least often taken to be part of our best account of what fundamental reality is like. And so the question we're asking here, why is spin discrete, is part of a family of metaphysical questions that concern nature at the most basic, at the deepest level. Now, by contrast to the continuity of space and time, for example, there is a sense in which physicists seem to think that spin's discreteness not just stands in need of an explanation, but it also can be explained. Indeed, it has from a mathematical physics standpoint, a fairly generic and standard explanation. If you ask a mathematical physicist, they're going to have an answer ready to go for why spin is discrete. They're going to appeal to a mathematical feature of rotational symmetry. Now, rotational symmetry is something that we have an intuitive grip on. Circular dinner plate, for example, any circular object has rotational symmetry. Now, in mathematical physics, rotational symmetry is captured by a pretty high-level mathematical device, namely a group, the rotation group. And so when you look at the kinds of explanations physicists give of things like spin's discreteness, you see them attributing certain mathematical properties to groups, in this case to the rotation group. This is based on a theorem that you find on the right-hand side of your handout. It's due to Peter and Weil, and it is at the heart of the mathematical story for why spin is discrete. The mathematical story that entails that spin is discrete, or its mathematical representation. Now don't worry yet if you don't know what a group is. In a moment I'm going to tell you everything for the purpose of this talk that you need to know about a group. So the explanation of spin's discreteness in terms of the rotation group is an instance of a fairly general and important pattern in modern fundamental physics. It's very common in physics, if you look at recent physics, to find explanations of important physical facts in terms of claims about symmetry, and in particular claims about symmetry groups. Physicists, you can find them explaining all sorts of things in terms of symmetries, facts about the nature of matter, the nature of physical properties, and even claims about the laws of nature. One example is what's become known as the classification of elementary particle kinds in terms of the Poincare group, something that's become one of the pillars of the standard model of elementary particles. But there is something quite puzzling about this style of explanation. Because according to this general explanatory strategy in physics, the symmetry-based explanatory strategy, it seems like physicists are explaining important physical facts in terms of, in a sense, the mathematical language, facts about the mathematical language we're using to describe the world. But of course there is a difference between the language we're using to describe the world in mathematical language and aspects of the world described in terms of that language. These are different things, and when we ask for an explanation of some physical fact, it seems like it's no good to appeal to a fact that seems to be just a fact about the mathematics. It's a bit like conflating the language we're using to say something with the thing we're saying. It seems indeed like explaining something like spin's discreteness in terms of a mathematical property of the rotation group is no better than explaining the fact about the structure of time in terms of the fact about the real line. Nobody would take seriously an explanation, for example, that explains the continuity of time by noting that time is measured by the real line, and the real line is continuous, so time is continuous. That's not a good explanation of the continuity of time. So the upshot, of course, is that we should be charitable to these explanations or to the people who state them. Of course, not as just giving this kind of plausible seeming explanation of physical facts in terms of facts about the mathematical language we're using, but as, of course, stating physical explanations that appeal to some sort of physical inventory, some physical entities to which the relevant symmetry groups correspond. Now, unfortunately, physicists don't say anything or hardly anything about what those truly physical entities are to which symmetry groups correspond. So far as symmetry groups are concerned, it seems like there is a gap, if you will, in the metaphysical picture painted by physics. We have a bunch of mathematics that seems to be, in a sense, really important in explaining important features of the world, for example, spin's discreteness. But we're not told what we're saying about the world when we engage in talk using those mathematical items. So to fill this gap, this seemingly large metaphysical gap in the picture of the world due to physics, we need to start getting, in a sense, metaphysically serious about symmetry groups. We need to start thinking about what the physical entities are, objects, properties, relations perhaps, to which symmetry groups correspond. And the goal of this talk is to do exactly that. I'll use the example of spin's discreteness as a starting off point, as an inspiration, if you will, to answer the much bigger question, namely how do symmetry-based explanations in general work? How are they possible? How can we understand them not just as mathematical explanations of mathematical facts in terms of other mathematical facts, but as bona fide physical explanations of physical facts in terms of other physical facts. And I'll do this by articulating or making a claim about ontology, at least articulating a partial ontology for the relevant theories, namely giving a theory, in a sense, of giving a specification of the physical entities to which groups correspond, an account that makes transparent what those entities are. And once we have such an account, in a sense we have what we want. We can now understand those mathematical explanations and the theorems which are used to express them as actually being explanations that appeal to those physical items. So we don't need to change the mathematical story at all that physicists give, but we can now give it physical content, if you will. Now, just a brief word of caution before I begin. There is at least one sort of fairly standard approach to ontological theorizing in the philosophy of physics. According to that standard approach, what you do is, when you interpret or ontologically theorize about some, say, mathematical framework, what you do is you go to the framework and you identify the mathematical items that you take to be representationally significant, or the items that correspond to some purely physical objects that the theory is about. Notably, this kind of approach does not require that we, in a sense, specify those items in maybe purely physical or non-mathematical terms. It's okay to then just keep using the mathematical language. There's no need to change the way we talk about these things. But in the present setting, it seems like the standard approach of just pointing at the mathematical objects and saying this is one of the representationally significant ones that corresponds to something or other in reality. It doesn't seem likely that it's going to give us the kind of insight that we're looking for in this case. And the reason is roughly that the kind of metaphysical vision that's at the heart of these symmetry-based explanations is one that seems to be quite heavily inspired by the mathematical formalism of physics. And moreover, it kind of enjoins us to be realist about an aspect of this mathematical formalism that we're not used to being realist about. Let me just explain what I mean. If somebody tells you they're realist about Euclidean space, you kind of immediately know what that person is committed to. That person is committed to a certain view about the structure of physical space. By contrast, it seems like someone who says, I'm a realist about the Poincare group, is making a sort of altogether less familiar and more puzzling claim. Merely saying that symmetry groups are representationally significant or that they correspond to some purely physical entities doesn't really allow us to see even dimly what those entities are. Indeed, we might run the risk of sort of being profoundly misunderstood. Some might hear us as kind of reifying mathematical entities, or as kind of holding at least to many people, implausible sounding views in kind of Pythagoreanism, where we think physical reality is literally constituted by mathematical entities. And of course, we'd like to avoid that. And one particularly powerful way to avoid this sort of thing is to be slightly more ambitious in ontological theorizing, in addition to pointing to the mathematical items that are representationally significant. We should also aim to specify the purely physical objects to which those mathematical items correspond in if you will, purely physical terms, in terms that at least allow us to see clearly the distinction between the mathematical language we're using to talk about the world and the things that we're talking about. That's what I mean by purely physical in this context. And that's exactly what I'm going to aim to do here. Okay, so just at the very end of this long introduction, let me just, of course, point out that there is a venerable tradition in the philosophy of physics and philosophy of science which has taken very seriously the centrality of symmetries in physics, that's object structural realism, and of course one important claim of this sort of tradition is that reality is fundamentally structural in the sense that it's supposed to be elucidated in large part by appeal to symmetries and symmetry groups. Indeed, symmetry groups are sometimes said to be a paradigm instance of this fundamental structure. So one way to look at what I'm doing here today is a sort of friendly approach, a friendly project for the structuralist. It's a way of sort of making this sometimes a bit vague sounding vision precise, giving it a clear metaphysical underpinning. So here's my plan for what's going to happen next. I will tell you in fairly intuitive general terms what the group is. I'll tell you what I take to be the candidate ontological counterpart of the group. I call those sameness relations. I'll then, in the third section, tell you more about the specific setting in which you find symmetry-based explanations of physics. Those are settings in which the relevant symmetries and symmetry groups are symmetries of state space. They might have other respects in which they're symmetries, and I'll mention those, but the relevant aspect for this kind of explanation is that they're state-space symmetries. And finally, I'll say more about the metaphysical vision that underlies those symmetry-based explanations, and I'll say more about what it is to be not just realist about the symmetry group, but also fundamentalist about it. And I'll say more about why that's an interesting question to ask when the time comes. Okay, so let's start with just a very intuitive, rough characterization of the notion of the group. So consider rotations of a concrete object. Take a weather vane. Something like that. It's an object that has a fixed axis of rotation, essentially rotations in a two-dimensional plane, if you will. Here's what it looks like from the top. You can rotate it in the obvious way from north to south. Now you can observe that it's got a couple of notable features. Rotations of the weather vane have a couple of notable features. You can undo any rotation, you can go east, and when there is another rotation that undoes it, goes back to the north. Every rotation can be reversed. Rotating once and rotating again is just doing a single rotation in a sense. And there is a rotation that amounts to doing nothing. So these are just some general features of rotations that we can identify in this case. Now note that those observations are completely independent of the object I'm considering. I could have considered rotations on a weather vane, I could have considered rotations instead of a brick or a football. And rotations of those objects have exactly the same features. All rotations about a fixed axis have something in common, and at an intuitive level, you can think of a group as a mathematical device that captures what's in common to rotations of any object whatsoever. About a fixed axis, for example. That's an intuitive notion of a group, and it's worth making a bit more precise how this is applied in physics. In general, we don't consider rotations of concrete objects, and rotations aren't physical motions, but we consider, in a sense, rotations of mathematical spaces rather than concrete objects, and rotations in these contexts arise as permutations of those mathematical spaces. Here is an example. Consider the space whose points correspond to orientations of the weather vane. Here is a point in that space, here is another. Just here are three examples of points in that space. Now, these are, of course, not points, but you can think of each point as corresponding to one of those situations. Now, when you consider a particular rotation, say by 90 degrees, you can say what it does to the first point. That point gets taken to that point, namely where the vane points east, where previously was pointing north. And of course, it doesn't just tell you what happens to the first point, it tells you what happens to any point. Rotating by 90 degrees is a rule that tells you something about how points change in general. So you can think of the angle of rotation of 90 degrees is associated with a particular permutation of points, a function that takes it from any given point to its image under rotation of 90 degrees. So, and now here is the slightly more sophisticated idea. Think of a group element as associated with a particular angle of rotation, and an angle of rotation is associated with a permutation of the space that we're considering, rotations of which we're considering. So group elements are something like, on this way of thinking, associated with permutations of a mathematical space that we're considering. So there is one such permutation for every angle of rotation. So that much shall suffice for the moment regarding groups. Now you might ask, so consider the following kind of setting. So we've talked about a mathematical space and implementations of a group on that kind of space. Now suppose that you meet someone who's realist about a certain mathematical space. That is someone who takes the mathematical space to be isomorphic to or to correspond to the physical space of concrete physical points. Say someone who's realist about Euclidean space. Now you might think that this person, well, yeah, you've told me lots about what rotations do to the space in terms of all these mathematical objects, permutations, angles, and so on and so forth. But is there a way to characterize this just in terms of claims about the things I'm already committed to, the points of the space, the concrete physical entities? Maybe in terms of relation among these points, but maybe something that doesn't just so heavily rely on abstract mathematical notions like group elements. And the answer seems to be yes. Because observe the core idea behind this mathematical characterization that I just gave, or sketched, or intuitively outlined of a group, is the following. So it was a characterization of group elements in terms of permutations and angles, and what it does is it gives us it gives us a way to say what it is to perform the same rotation at different points in the space. That is, it gives us a notion of asking, say, given that one point B, so we, say take Euclidean space, given that, one point B is the outcome of a rotation of point A. What is the outcome of doing to a distinct point, C, what we had to do to A to obtain B? So in a sense, more precisely, the one count gives us, allows us to say what it is for points A and B to differ as much by the relevant transformation as do some other points C and D. That's in a sense, if you will, an important substrate of what we were saying in mathematical terms. And this you can consider, it is a four-place relation among the points of that space. It is the relation that obtains between 4 points, just in case the first two differ as much by rotation in the same direction, and so on and so forth, as do points C and D, or the last 2 points. And in this sense, it captures the core idea behind, at least one aspect of the core idea behind the mathematical characterization of groups in terms of angles and permutations of points in mathematical space. And I'll call four-place relations like that sameness relations where we go. We have transformations of the appropriate kind by the same amount in the same direction. Sameness relations. There is a sense in which sameness relations are what we're looking for. They are the candidate entities to which groups correspond. Here is why. Take the sameness relation that corresponds to, say, rotations of points in Euclidean space. That relation you can think of as an equivalence relation on ordered pairs of points in Euclidean space. Namely, this ordered pair, AB, is equivalent to CD just in case A differs from B in a rotation in the same direction as much as does C from D. Then these 2 points are equivalent. So for each equivalence, it's an equivalence relation, has equivalence classes, points that all differ by the same amount in the same direction under rotation. And so in particular, there is, for each of the equivalence class, you can find an angle such that these points differ by rotation by that angle. So each equivalence class you can think of as corresponding to a particular group element. Equivalence classes under that equivalence relation correspond to group elements, and the collection of equivalence classes then, if you want to have a concrete counterpart, if you will, of a group, it's those collections of equivalence classes that correspond to it. But really the action is in the four-place relation, the sameness relation. And now also note that this four-place relation feels like it's the kind of purely physical relation that we're after. It's a relation that's only between the concrete entities that we're already committed to in this case, points of Euclidean space, for example. So it seems like we've got a kind of purely physical counterpart that we were looking for. And of course note that it's not dependent on just looking at the rotation group. These things can be any transformations, any permutations whatsoever, as long as they have group structure. So it's kind of a fairly general kind of relation. It's a candidate for being an ontological counterpart of a group. Okay, so far, what have I done? I've just explained a general kind of entity that is a candidate for being a non-mathematical, purely physical counterpart of a group, but we're not done yet. We want to deploy those relations, those counterparts of groups, for elucidating explanations of physical facts in terms of symmetry groups. And to accomplish that, we need to understand 2 more things. On the one hand, we need to understand what it is for a group to be a symmetry group in the relevant settings, and what the mathematical spaces is on which they're, in a sense, implemented. In which we're associating permutations of that space with group elements. And that's what is going to happen next. Great, so I said earlier that we have this intuitive grip on what a symmetry is. Circular dinner plate is symmetric under rotations in the sense that very intuitively there is an axis such that if you rotate it about that axis, for example, it looks the same as before for any angle of rotation. That example conveys something quite important. You can think of any symmetry of an object as associated with some way of changing the object that preserves some important feature or property. And that's a basic idea of symmetry that's reflected in the symmetry, the notion of symmetry that's relevant to symmetry-based explanations of physical facts like spin's discreteness. In those cases, though, the idea is not that we're considering ways of changing a concrete object, like a dinner plate, but rather a mathematical space. A good example, again, is Euclidean space. There are various permutations, various kinds of permutations of Euclidean space that count as symmetries of Euclidean space. For example, rigid shifts or rigid rotations. And the reason why these count as symmetries is that they preserve what you might think of as the characteristic structural feature of Euclidean space, namely the Euclidean metric. They preserve Euclidean distances, and any permutation that has this feature gets to be called a symmetry. And that's an observation that holds quite generally for any mathematical space, or almost for lots of mathematical spaces at least. There is a range of permutations that preserves the features of those spaces that we have identified as the characteristic ones. So it's a fairly general observation. So what does it take for a group to be a symmetry group of a mathematical space? Well, it's just so to recall that earlier we considered a group in relation to a particular mathematical space, and we said we associate with each element, mathematically speaking, we associate a way of reshuffling points in that space, a permutation on that space. So this means that a group is a symmetry group of that space, just in case the permutations that each group element is associated with is a symmetry of that space, preserves the characteristic structural feature of that space. That's what it is for a group to be a symmetry group for some mathematical space. For example, to say that the rotation group is a symmetry group of Euclidean space is just to say that each group element is associated with a permutation of Euclidean space that preserves the Euclidean metric. So now we're in the position to sort of, in a sense, understand the final piece of the puzzle regarding the symmetry-based explanations of physical facts, such as the discreteness of spin. The kind of mathematical space whose symmetry groups occur in those explanations are not things like Euclidean space, but they're state spaces, or rather the mathematical spaces that are used to characterize state spaces. Let me just briefly tell you what a state space is. First of all, intuitively you can think of an instantaneous state of a system as the shortest and maximally informative thing you can say about the system at that instant of time. Roughly, it's a fact about the system at that time that fixes every other variable fact about the system at that time. One example that we consider is, you can take that from classical particle mechanics. In that kind of setting, there's one way to think about the setting where there are two basic variable quantities, position and velocity or momentum. They're basic in the sense that the value of those quantities at a time for every particle fix the values of every other variable physical quantity at that time. So in particular, the shortest maximum informative thing I can tell you about a particle system in classical mechanics at a time are the values of position and momentum of every particle. That's an instantaneous state of an n-particle system. Here is an example of, here is an example of an instantaneous state, if you will, of a two-particle system. The arrows indicate the velocities and the dots the spatial locations. Now, state space is just the space of all states of a system, all instantaneous states. So you can think of state space on the left, and if you zoom in on a point, you get a situation like the one shown on the right. State space, so of course, state space is subject to the constraint that the system can be in at most and no less than one state at every instant of time, in exactly one state at every instant of time. State space, not just for that reason, but partly for that reason, has a kind of modal flavor. It feels like a sort of state of possibility. So very often you hear people say, it's the space of possible states, and since you can only be in one state at every instant of time, it seems very different from a physical space, Euclidean space, for example, that we take to be the space inhabited by macro objects that we are familiar with. But I'm not going to say more about the modal connections here. So the mathematical spaces that we use to characterize state spaces all have their own characteristic structural features. The features that stand to those spaces, like the Euclidean metric stands to Euclidean space. The kind of feature that needs to be preserved by symmetry of state space. these mathematical spaces, for it to count as a symmetry of state space. But for present purposes, we don't need to go into more detail about what those features are. So there's some complicated mathematical stories to be told here. So just call a state space symmetry a symmetry, a commutation of a mathematical space characterizing state space that preserves the characteristic structure of that space. An example of a state space symmetry in classical particle mechanics, for example, are the mathematical commutations that correspond to shifting individual particles through physical space. For example, here is an instance of the effect of a particle shift symmetry on a particular state. It just takes a step on the left, a step on the right, where one particle has a different location, everything else is the same. Those things are, in this case, in the classical case, symmetry of phase space. And of course, at that point, it's easy to say what a state space symmetry group is. It's just a group whose elements are associated with state space symmetries, with permutations of points in state space that preserve the characteristic structural feature of the mathematical space that represents state space. And explanations of physical facts, such as the descriptions of spin, appeal to symmetry groups of exactly this sort. That's the kind of basis, the mathematical basis of the explanation of things like the descriptions of spin. Now just a quick word about where dynamical symmetries fit in here. Dynamical symmetries, in a sense, are a kind of state space symmetries. They're a state space symmetry that satisfies an extra constraint, namely of preserving the laws. Every dynamical symmetry is a state space symmetry, but not the other way around. Symmetries figure in these symmetry-based explanations that I'm concerned with here, only in virtue or qua or whatever, being state space symmetries, not in virtue of being dynamical symmetries, even though some of them are. But that feature of symmetries is strictly not necessary to understand the mechanics of these kinds of explanations. So let me briefly summarize what we've achieved so far. I've explained three things. The first thing I've explained is that sameness relations are candidates for being the ontological counterparts of groups, four-place relations, that is, among points of the physical space that corresponds to the relevant mathematical space, the one that we're considering, the one on which we've implemented the group. The second thing I explained is the notion of a symmetry group. What makes a group? A symmetry group of a mathematical space. It's the group whose elements is associated with the symmetries of that space. And the third thing I've explained is the notion of a state space of a physical system, the space whose symmetry groups are involved in the relevant explanations that we're concerned with here. So this means that we've got all we need to understand these ostensibly mathematical explanations of facts like spin's discreteness in terms of symmetry groups, as explanations in terms of just in terms of purely physical entities, as actual physical explanations. State space symmetry groups correspond to sameness relations on state space, with individual group elements corresponding to equivalence classes under the sameness relations, equivalence classes of ordered pairs of states. So the physical content of an explanation of a physical fact, in terms of, say, an attribution of a mathematical property to a mathematical object in this group, is really revealed as a physical explanation of this fact in terms of the sameness relation that corresponds to the group. More specifically, given that we now have a way to, that we now have a grasp of the purely physical counterpart of state space symmetry groups, we can understand the mathematical theorems that entail, for example, that spin is discrete, as stating not just mathematical claims, but as stating physical explanations of the relevant facts, namely in terms of physical explanations that appeal to those relevant sameness relations. Let me just quickly make an important remark about what just happened. I gave you an account, in the sense of the physical meat behind an ostensibly or apparently mathematical explanation of physical facts in terms of symmetry groups. But you might think I could have done this way more briskly. You might think I could have just pointed to the mathematical stuff and said, the groups, and said, whatever this corresponds to, whatever item that those corresponds to, those things are the ones that really explain it. And I could have finished right there, right then, and it could have spared you the last 20 minutes. But now, I take it, we can sort of we can see at least dimly what the advantage of doing it this way is. We now have a grasp of, I hope, of the physical counterpart of a purely mathematical thing, a group. The kind of thing that we talk about when we talk about groups, namely the sameness, the kind of relation that I've called sameness relations. And I've told you, at least the ambition has been to tell you in purely physical terms what this thing is, in terms that makes clear the distinction between the mathematical language we're using on the one hand and the things we're describing in terms of the language on the other hand. That I take to be the key import of this kind of approach. Finally, let me tell you a bit more about the larger metaphysical vision that I take to be behind symmetry-based explanations of things like the discreteness of spin. I said earlier that Ken's symmetries and symmetries in general have a really great explanatory significance in modern physics, and they've become so important that lots of physicists have started going around saying things like symmetry should be regarded as fundamental aspect of reality. People like Stephen Weinberg have said things like that. And moreover, we should regard symmetries as being more fundamental than what we ordinarily thought of as the building blocks of the world, things like particles, for example. And of course, that's where I think a great deal of the motivation behind structuralism comes from, that we can dispense with these entities at the fundamental level. And it sounds like a really radical and intriguing and exciting idea, but what I've said so far doesn't really help us understand that vision at all. So far I've only explained what the ontological counterparts are. I haven't said anything about whether they're fundamental and what it would mean for them to be fundamental. What I've said so far is perfectly compatible with them being non-fundamental. I've only explained, in a sense, realism about symmetry groups. I haven't explained fundamentalism about symmetry groups, and it'll be worth spending a few moments just to get clear on what that kind of metaphysical picture could look like. And again, a good case study here is classical n-particle mechanics. Just because we can draw nice pictures with particles on them. There was one, I guess, it's so entrenched that it's even kind of strange to call it a metaphysical view, but I guess there is a standard ontology for particle mechanics. What is the theory about particles? Particles and their fundamental properties. That in physical space, moving around with certain velocities and so on and so forth, call this kind of particles first ontology. Why particles first? Because according to the particles first person, state space is a non-fundamental thing. Whenever the world or the system is in a certain state at an instant of time, well, then that's because the fundamental particles are at certain locations at that time and instantiate certain values of velocity or momentum or what have you at that time. In a sense, I never need to mention state space in my theorizing unless I'm really a big fan of Hamiltonian mechanics. For at least lots of purposes, I never need to mention it. There is an alternative metaphysical option, though, one that you might never have thought about adapting in the classical setting, but I take it that becomes a bit more relevant in the quantum setting, a view that I call state-space substantivalism. It's the view according to which fundamental reality is populated by, and indeed exhausted by states, rather than by particles or points of physical space. And the state-space substantivalist is someone who takes the same attitude towards state space as the space-time substantivalist takes towards physical space-time. For the state-space substantivalist, state space really is the fundamental arena in which the history of the world unfolds. And it's, of course, it goes without saying that state-space substantivalism is a metaphysical picture that differs radically from more entrenched, familiar ways to think about ontology, especially from the familiar particles first ontology. According to state-space substantivalism, the fundamental story of physical reality doesn't mention particles at all. It doesn't mention points of space. It doesn't mention velocity, values, momentum, quantities, and so on and so forth. Points of space are regarded as primitive items in the ontology. We can no longer regard them as sort of complex facts about the positions and momentum of particles. They're just primitive entities. And when two states are distinct, this means that it's not the case that they're distinct because they disagree about particles. They disagree about the position and momentum of particles. They're just simply different, primitively different. And so, after Jonathan's talk yesterday, it occurred to me that there is a way to think of state-space substantivalism as kind of in a monistic way, where so substantivalism seems to imply that we're thinking of points of state spaces, first order entities, just like points of physical space, for example. But you can have a different version of state space substantivalism where what you really have are fundamental monadic properties and a single individual, the world, subject to the constraint that the world as a whole instantiates exactly one state at every instant of time. And then you have a bunch of properties and relations among states, and everything else, and of course this is the big challenge, everything else has got to be derivable from just that inventory. Properties and relations among states, and facts about which state is actual at the time, which state the world instantiates. That's just one option to cash out state space substantivalism. I'm personally more inclined to take, if I were to be state space substantivalist, I would sort of take the substantivalism by its word and consider these points of state space as actual first order entities, but that's not obligatory for the purposes of this paper. But the burden can be met, the burden of proof can be met, as I've shown elsewhere. You can actually, even in the classical case, give an account of how you can account for particle talk, just in terms of states in the state space theoretic language, just in terms of states. I'm not going to say more about this here, but it's possible to meet this challenge. What I want to stress here is that fundamentalism about symmetry groups, which is something like fundamentalism about sameness relation, the view that you can't, say, define it in more basic terms, is a natural combination with state space substantivalism. There are at least two reasons for this. The first is it seems to be a very odd combination of views to be a particle's first person, someone who thinks particle fundamental and state space isn't, and at the same time to be a fundamentalist about state space symmetries. Because that is someone who thinks, oh, state space is not a fundamental thing, I never need to mention state space in my theorizing about my particle system, and yet I'm fundamentalist about a four-place relation, or some four-place relations on state space. That seems to be an odd combination of views. It's not a knockdown argument, but it would be strange for the particle's first person to even go in for that sort of view, given that it's just lots of non-fundamental stuff that doesn't need to be mentioned in the basic bottom line story, if you will, of what the world is like according to this person. But there is at least one other reason for why fundamentalism about state space symmetries and state space substantivalism seems to be a happy combination and should be regarded as a package deal. And that's got to do with the setting in which we tend to encounter symmetry-based explanations of things like spin discreteness, namely quantum mechanics. As opposed to classical mechanics, the particles first ontology just isn't an option in quantum mechanics. In other words, there is no view, no metaphysics for quantum mechanics according to which the states of the world fix the positions and momenta of every particle, as is the case in classical mechanics. So the conjunction of particles first ontology with fundamentalism about state-space symmetries just isn't available in quantum mechanics. And of course, we want the conclusions we draw from a case study like classical mechanics to be transferable or applicable to the quantum setting. So that seems to be not a very helpful combination of views. So that makes me inclined to say that these two views tend to come together. That's the first upshot of this section, namely, it seems like if we want to be fundamentalist about symmetries, symmetry groups, fundamentalist about the sameness relation, it's a relation on states, we should also be fundamentalist about state space. I should have mentioned that I'm considering state space substantivalism to be fundamentalism about state space rather than just realism about state space. I think that was sort of, maybe it was clear from what I said. And the second result is that the resulting metaphysical package deal, in a sense, is one according to which the symmetry-based explanations that we find in physics, like the explanation of spin's discreteness in terms of an aspect of the rotation group, are best understood as appealing to fundamental relations among fundamental entities, and fundamental sameness relations among the instantaneous states of the world. Okay, so let me just wrap up quickly. The concern of this talk was a fairly general explanatory strategy according to which important physical facts like the discreteness of spin are explained in terms of what it seems like explained in terms of mathematical objects, namely symmetry groups. And we started out with the observation that there was kind of a gap in the metaphysical picture of the world according to physics, although we'd like to understand those explanations as bona fide physical explanations that appeal to purely physical entities that correspond to symmetry groups, physicists don't really tell us what those entities are. So it's hard for us to be charitable here, even though we really want to. And the goal of this paper has been to fill precisely this gap and to identify those physical entities, and thereby to give this explanatory strategy, the one that appeals to symmetries, a clear and precise metaphysical underpinning. So the goal has been to identify the ontological counterparts of symmetry groups, and according to what I've explained or tried to explain, the ontological counterparts of symmetry groups are just sameness relations on state space. The kinds of notions that capture, for example, the idea of rotating by the same amount in the same direction. That's how you can think of it, just to remind you. So the main result of this enterprise is that the explanations of physical facts, which seem to appeal to attributions of mathematical properties to mathematical objects, and the symmetry groups can be understood as physical explanations. And so now, we don't need to go back and change the mathematics, God forbid, but now we can understand the mathematics in the way we always wanted, the mathematical theorems, as being ipso facto physical explanations, as appealing to physical material, namely the sameness relations. In addition, we saw that fundamentalism about symmetry groups, fundamentalism about the relevant sameness relations, seems like a natural fit with state-space substantivalism, the view that the fundamental arena in which the history of the world unfolds isn't something like Euclidean space or Lorentzian space or whatever it is, state space. And this means, of course, that fundamentalism about symmetry groups on a natural package deal is a significant departure from our familiar ways of thinking about the world. We're used to thinking that fundamental reality is somehow populated by things located in physical space-time and moving around in it. Things that there are many of, and now we look at fundamentalism about symmetries and we find that seems to be completely wrong. Fundamentally, there are states and maybe the world that occupies some state at some time, and that's it, and then relations among states and properties of states, and that's it. And really, all what we took to be the fundamental building blocks of the world arise non-fundamentally from this basic picture. So I mentioned earlier that this kind of project could be understood as friendly to ontic structuralism. Given the discussion yesterday following Jonathan's talk about the specific desiderata of structuralism, I'll leave it to you to decide exactly the extent to which it does satisfy those criteria. I also, in this kind of ontology, first-order objects do occur. So it's, I guess, an open question, or well, you might say it's questionable whether it really satisfies the most ambitious structuralist desideratum. But it certainly takes on board a lot of physical motivation behind structuralism. Thank you.
Thank you, David, for a simple talk. We'll break of 1 minute so you can collect your thoughts.
1 minute? We had 2 minutes.
It's 2 minutes. It's short. Tomorrow will be 30 seconds. The French talk 10 seconds.
So, who wants to ask a question? Steve number 1, Guido number 2, Manali number 3, Jonathan number 4. Okay, let's start
Can we
with
maybe
Steve.
put Kerry as number 6, even though she's not here? Because I'm sure she'll have a question.
Okay, Carrie is number. Go ahead, Steve.
Thanks, David. I thought that was lovely, very clear. There's a lot there that I can, well, you can just feed into the more of ontic structural realism and to chew on. But I have one sort of major concern. Maybe I missed it. You kind of set out to explain the discreteness of spin, and you kind of didn't, right? Because compactness. You've got sameness relations, you've got the substantival state space, okay, what's the physical correlate of compactness? So, one response, and this is the hand-wavy response, would be, well, compactness is the mathematical term that we use to describe that feature of the relevant state space and the sameness relations, and I don't have a metaphysical correlate to that. But without that, someone's going to say, yeah, you haven't really given us the physical explanation of compactness, which is how we mathematically capture the notion of discreteness. I was just wondering if you had a little bit more to say on that.
So I have a different hand-wavy response, but before I give it, I just say, in a sense, I didn't say exactly what's discrete. I said much more. I gave you a general template, in a sense.
So we have to do the work?
For giving those explanations for any group whatsoever.
Right.
But of course, you're right. I didn't give you even the exact form of the explanans here, because I haven't told you what compactness is.
Yeah.
My hand-wavy response would be, I said earlier, we're used to being realist about some aspects of the mathematical formalism. I think topology is one that is a lot more familiar by those lights than groups themselves. When we talk about physical space, I think we routinely attribute topological properties to not just mathematical objects, but to parts of physical space, and so on and so forth, to physical space itself. So I don't think there is a mystery here about whatever you do in those cases, whatever understanding you have of a topological property when you attribute it to physical space, you can do that here. And of course the idea is the thing that you're attributing something to is, well, you can either regard it just as the sameness relation, or it is something definable in terms of it. So the compactness of the rotation would amount to the compactness of this collection of equivalence classes, for example, where you would have to probably specify them.
That's the thing. That's what I'm not quite, what that would amount to in... I took your point at the very beginning that it should not be the case that any explanation requires us to give up all mathematical talk and translate it all into physical talk or metaphysical talk. But nevertheless, the worry with what you've just said is, compactness in mathematical terms corresponds to the compactness of the equivalence class of the sameness relations, and the metaphysicians in the room are still saying, still haven't kind of quite got a grip on that in a way that it will function as an appropriate explanand. And maybe it's an insolvable problem.
Yeah, different ambitions exist in the vicinity of the sort of project.
Okay.
There are people who, like Hartree Field, who would find this woefully inadequate. I'm sympathetic to this very ambitious project, one where you don't like mathematics at all and want to get rid of all of it. But I'm also happy to, because in some parts of physics it's going to be prohibitively difficult, just rest content that it can be done. We have this kind of faith in this kind of mathematics that we can find this kind of these axiomatizations and proofs, and we can give them. But my goal is just to look at those aspects of the mathematical formalism that I find, and I may not be the only one, that I found to be particularly puzzling, and say what those correspond to. I'm less puzzled by topological properties. Metaphysicians might have a different, especially, you are not just worried about the topological property, but also about the thing, namely this thing pretty far up in the set-theoretic hierarchy to which you attribute it. I don't have those worries, so maybe I'm just not, in that sense, in tune with metaphysicians' worries here. But I wouldn't. So I guess in that sense, I'm on the more standard sort of mathematics first side when it comes to at least some aspects of the formalism and topological.
Great, thanks.
You occasionally mention space-time, mainly to make analogies with substantivalism. But I think there's a much deeper analogy between what you're doing and the dynamical approach to space-time, a la Harvey Brown, the idea that space-time just is the codification of the universal symmetries of the laws, and maybe just to sort of spill that up, make that clearer. If we go back to sort of the original presentation of that, Poincaré, Science and Hypothesis, Poincaré is talking about the states of an object, and there might transformations of states. There might be different color, different temperature, but certain kinds of transformations are special because you can always undo them by changing the reference, and that's exactly the sameness relations there, and that's why we call these spatial transformations, and we abstract space from the behavior of objects, and that's what you are doing, and in space-time literature, I think that approach matches exactly what you're doing here, and maybe it's I don't know if you agree, but it's worth. I think it's worth looking at the relation of the parallels.
Interesting connection, thanks. I feel like from how you presented it, there is a difference here because it seems like how you were describing Harvey Brown's strategy, the laws come first in a sense. In my order of inference at least, maybe epistemological priority in the way I'm looking at this. That's not true here. In terms of metaphysics and ontology, the laws aren't mentioned at all at that level. Now you might ask, like, how do we come to consider something like rotational symmetry in the first place? Of course, we came to consider it as a result of the rotational invariance of the laws. But the kind of use that it is put to in physics, at least in these settings of like 1920s quantum mechanics and classical mechanics, doesn't mention the laws. Things get a bit more complicated when you move to like a relativistic setting, but I don't think. So I think there was a difference between the order of inferential priority and metaphysical priority, if you will. In my case, these two things come apart. And maybe in Harvey's case, they don't.
Shall we talk later about this?
Manali.
So, interesting talk. Like to discuss more later, but one question that did come to mind was point 2 in the notes, where you say there is no particles first metaphysics for quantum mechanics, i.e. no metaphysics according to which quantum states fix positions and momentum of particles. So I guess you don't specify here what you mean by quantum mechanics exactly. If you have in mind something like an Everettian view or something like a PRW view.
Anything but Bohm.
Anything but why take the question against Bohmian versus quantum mechanics?
But even in Bohmian mechanics, I mean, it's more complicated. Of course, the state of the system. Sorry, you weren't finished.
No, well, I mean, if one just means by quantum mechanics, any theory that's reproduces the phenomena that we call quantum phenomena, then in this sense, Bohmian mechanics is a quantum version of quantum mechanics, and in that version, quantum states do fix the position and momentum of particles, and then there is a notion of state space, right, relevant to that approach, and R3, not R3n, once you quotient out permutations, right, of the particle coordinates.
Yeah.
So that seems like a consistent view, no?
So what I have in mind here is, and that's a kind of even true in Bohmian mechanics, when by state you mean the quantum state, which is, I guess, used in quantum mechanics in a different sense, especially for Bohmians, than it is used in classical mechanics. In classical mechanics is basically all there is to be said about the system. The quantum state in Bohmian mechanics doesn't tell you everything there is to be said about the system because they also need to, they're also particles in their positions, right? So, but it's still, but there is, of course, there is a state in the classical sense in Bohmian mechanics too, namely one which doesn't just tell you about the wave function, but also tell you about whatever that thing corresponds to, but also tell you about the particles. But it's also true of Bohmian mechanics that the quantum state, the wave function, doesn't fix the position and velocities of particles.
Right, the wave function alone does this.
Exactly.
So I guess
this is why I said Bohm, anything but Bohm. It wasn't meant to beg the question. It was just, so the qualification would have been in order, absolutely. There is a class of, I guess, theories of quantum mechanics which agree with each other as to the kinematics. So they differ about one adopt a collapse rule, the other just take Schrödinger equation as the dynamical rule, but those agree as to the fact that states don't fix the position of momentum of particles. If there are particles in those theories, I guess there are non-fundamental ones. You give us non-fundamental, or they're just not at all like classical particles. They're just not the sorts of things that have determinate values of position of momentum at all, which is consistent with what I'm saying. Quantum mechanics is a special case because the formalism differs pretty radically from, in more ways than just by the dynamical equations, from this other class of theories. Thank you.
Jonathan?
All right, I was also wondering about foam, but let me switch to a different question. Just kind of, so I like the space-based substantivalism, and a question that is occurring to me is there going to be any explanation about the size or structure of the space? So one thing that I think people who like kind of particles first approaches will want to do is they'll want to say we can explain the size and the structure of the state space as built up of the particles. Oh, why does the state space have so and so many dimensions? Why is it say in quantum calculus why 3n dimensions? Oh, because there's n particles. Why can't it have an odd number of dimensions? If you're a state space fundamentalist, it's a strange restriction to say your fundamental space must have dimensions that are multiple for you're writing the fundamental space that any dimensions whatsoever. And there's also a kind of similarity relationship, some distance that's living on state space that you might think, well, the distances between states, has to do with the changes run onto the individual particles. Is this all just going to, I guess this is all just going to be primitive for the state space fundamentalist. Is there any kind of maybe strategy where, well, I'm explaining some things that you're not, or how do you answer this explanatory?
So first of all, note that this is a particularly classical particle mechanics problem. I guess there are some of the questions you want to ask about the Hilbert space fundamentalist. Although not maybe necessarily, I'm not sure there's a correlation directly between the dimensionality of the Hilbert space and the number of particles the way there is in classical mechanics. What can be explained? What is the cash value, as Dave will put it, of space-based substantivalism? I wouldn't have entertained it unless it was kind of what seems to me part of the natural package of some kind of symmetry fundamentalism. A setting in which you can make sense of seemingly pretty important and stable robust claims by physicists and philosophers alike. That symmetry is a part of our best bottom level story about what the world is like. And if you look at the details for what those symmetries are, they're just, in a sense, they come out as these relations among states. So that's how I got led to this sort of view. It is, of course, a radical revision of metaphysics. So there's a high intuitive cost here to be paid.
Okay. Carrie, while you have been away, Stephen predicted that you would have a question.
Apologies for my presumption.
Simon.
Another failure of induction.
Simon.
I guess, David, I did find myself asking what exactly has the symmetry. So forgive me, I have to ask a very elementary question. What has the symmetry? In this case, rotational symmetry. What has rotational symmetry?
So, the way I'm talking, symmetry is reserved for a mathematical commutation of a mathematical space. And the task is to say, what do those things correspond to? Now, it might, there's going to be comparable claims just in terms of the same relations, but it's not the case that you can, these are not, these concrete spaces, there are mathematical permutations, something like that, that live on them.
So is it the space that has the symmetry? Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
It connects back with what Guido was asking actually, because I've always understood what has symmetry is, point theory anyway, is the dynamics, is the Hamiltonian. And in classical physics too, it's the dynamics that has the symmetries.
Well, there's one notion of symmetry.
Sorry?
That's one notion of symmetry.
Well,
The kind of symmetry that figures in those explanations is a different notion. It's the notion of state space symmetry.
so the state space is something physical, right? For the tube,
Yes.
and it's got rotational symmetry, right? I mean, I understand, for example, what it is for Euclidean space to have rotational symmetry with translational symmetries. Do I think of the state space as having rotational symmetry in the same way as Euclidean space has rotational symmetry? No.
Well,
I mean, Euclidean space, of course, being a geometric space, we can talk about symmetries as the isometries of the metric. Going to your state space.
so in phase space, there are symplectomorphisms.
Right.
So those are the state space symmetries in classical
Sure, and
unit
again,
transformations in quantum mechanics.
right, so we've
Those
got
are
a
the
notion,
symmetries we're talking about.
right, we've got a notion of symplectic structure, and the symmetries are what lead by symplectic structure is invariant. So the state space which has the rotational symmetry, what is the structure of the space such that it has that symmetry?
Well, when I talk about the symmetry of the classical state space, I'm talking about the symmetries of phase space.
Phase
The
space.
mathematical space to which state space corresponds, which is admittedly a slight abuse of my own terminology here, but that's just because it allows me to state a general level without committing myself to what, like if I say phase space symmetry, I can't use that term for quantum mechanics, so I call it state space symmetry, but it's still it's supposed to be a mathematical thing, and a kind of mathematical computation of the space that preserves the characteristic like structure,
Right.
which is
No, I do get that for a symplectic space. I get it for a metric space. I know what symmetries mean in those cases. I get it for a manifold and diffeomorphism symmetry. I'm struggling to get it with the state space which has rotational symmetry.
rotational symmetry just means you have an action of the rotation group on the space, and what makes that action a symmetry is that it preserves the relevant structural feature. It's exactly the same. It's just not going to...
What is the relevant structural feature?
The symplectic form in classical mechanics, or the inner product in quantum mechanics.
May I support Simon there? I mean, the symplectic invariance of symplectic form invariance of the inner product. I mean, that just gives us say, unitary transformations in quantum mechanics, but some unitary transformations are going to be even more special, the ones that represent rotations, and what makes those special is the fact that the dynamics is symmetric under those.
I understand the idea, say, of a two-dimensional complex space, vector space, as supporting a representation of the rotation group. Of course, we've got that. But it's hard for me to understand the space as having that symmetry. I understand the Hamiltonianism of that symmetry. And for those spaces where we do have a structure on the space, and we define symmetries in terms of the invariance of that structure, fine, symplectic geometry, including geometry, custom geometry. What is the rotation geometry?
I think we may just have a problem of different terminology here, because I'm not, all I'm talking about are representations of groups in those spaces, or actions of them. And what makes it a rotational, this maybe confusing way of speaking that I've been engaging in, what makes it a rotational symmetry is just that it's an action of the rotation group that is a symmetry of the space that it's acting on, in the standard sense. Not in the sense of like, oh, I can actually understand the flows of that action, something like that, or the flows to which an action corresponds as like taking me around a circle or something like a rotation group. That's not supposed to be the intuition, it's a much more general thing.
But doesn't it worry you that with other symmetries one can speak about an invariant structure? And that in the cases of rotations, we don't seem to have that. So to repeat, Euclidean case, Euclidean metric, and custom metric, we can talk about invariances of that structure and then we get out a group. And it just doesn't seem to be anything quite like that working with rotations on its own.
Well, there is a good question, like for a space like phase space, what is the invariance group of that space?
Yeah,
And
no,
it's
sure.
certainly the rotation group,
It's
like
a subgroup.
at least the canonical
subgroup.
actions you have on it. They're going to be a subgroup, of
Yeah, yeah,
course.
yeah. No, you can
But that's
actually-
fine. Like I'm not, because the relevant groups in a sense that allow us to specify the kind of particular individualistic structure in terms of the space-based notions are not going to be rotations anyway. They're going to be shifts. Those are the things that do all the heavy lifting in the case of classical mechanics. So no, it doesn't worry. I hope it doesn't worry you too much.
Well, that's nice.
Well, I'm not worried about
Are you fine, David? Yeah. Okay. Well, let's end it here then. We reconvene at what is it, 11:15? Next door? Yes. Okay. You stick to the program. Thank you, David.